It was the night before the fantasy championship, and all through the house, not a fantasy manager was stirring, not even the one that sends those really bad trade offers. The cleats were hung by the chimney with care in hopes that Justin Jefferson and a trophy would soon be there. Perhaps the greatest gift of all this holiday season is the gift of Mike Evans. Well, maybe not, but I've committed myself to this show for Mike Evans Watch. Last Sunday, Evans hauled in 5 passes for 69 yards, pushing that season total to 812 receiving yards. That's 182 yards shy of extending his consecutive 1,000-yard receiving streak. Evans, he's going to need 91 receiving yards per game over the final 2 contests to cement his legacy. In Week 17, Tampa, they host the Carolina Panthers. Then in Week number 18, the New Orleans Saints, they come marching into Tampa Bay. This is well within the possibilities of going down once more. Speaking of going down, some wide receivers went down last week, including Tank Dell, who was lost for the season with a torn ACL and a dislocated knee. We also saw CeeDee Lamb, Drake London, and T. Higgins all scheduled for an MRI on Monday. And if you're looking for receiver help, you probably need it more now than ever before. Luckily for you, we at RotoBaller, we got you covered with the Week 17 starts and sits at the wide receiver position. Starting with Devonte Adams of the New York Jets as they take on the Buffalo Bills. Look, Devonte Adams, he knows how to play in the cold. After all, he spent 8 years in Green Bay, many alongside Aaron Rodgers. And I'm referring about the cold weather in Green Bay, just not the frosty exterior, the Grinch-like atmosphere that Aaron Rodgers tends to give off. Now, of note, Aaron Rodgers, he was also scheduled for an MRI on Monday, which is something that we need to keep an eye on. Since the Jets' bye week there in week number 12, only Jamar Chase has averaged more fantasy points per game than Adams, who has averaged 26.5 fantasy points over that span. Adams' 47 targets in the last 4 contests are the 9th most amongst pass catchers. And now let's look at the metrics here for success. 31.3% target share, a 0.3 targets per route run rate, 39.2% first read target share, and a 0.141 first downs per route run, not to mention 6 end zone targets resulting in 4 touchdowns, while also accounting for a team receiving market share of 41.3%. Only A.J. Brown and Puka Nacua account for a more outstanding team receiving market share than Adams has. I don't need to understand analytics to understand that success will surely follow if I add those opportunities all together. Success has also followed wide receivers taking on the Buffalo Bills here over the last 4 weeks. Buffalo, over that period, no team has allowed more fantasy points to receivers than the 48.37 in which the Bills have yielded. Another wide receiver that's absolutely balling out as of late is Terry McLaurin of the Washington Commanders, and this week they take on the Atlanta Falcons. Last week there was a challenge, one that Terry McLaurin met head on. In the previous contest against the Eagles, McLaurin was held to just 1 reception for 10 yards. On Sunday, McLaurin, he exercised those demons to a degree, hauling in 5 passes for 60 yards and another touchdown reception, his 12th of the season. McLaurin has produced 13 or more fantasy points in 12 of his last 13 contests, and since week number 3, only Chase, Justin Jefferson, and Amon-Ra St. Brown have averaged more than the 18 fantasy points per game than McLaurin has. Now, since week 12, McLaurin has been as good as any receiver in the NFL. That includes Devonte Adams. McLaurin's metrics also support his production, as he has earned a 29% first read target share and an overall target share of 21.7, leading the Commanders' air yard share with 37.7%. More importantly for fantasy managers, a receiving touchdown market share of 50% over the last 5 weeks. Now, McLaurin became the first Washington receiver to have 1,000 yards receiving in 5 consecutive seasons. Only he and Justin Jefferson have strung together 5 successive 1,000-yard seasons dating back to 2020. Now, we're still waiting to see if Mike Evans, Devonte Adams, and Tyreek Hill can join the club this year. The third wide receiver that I want to talk about, how about Jacoby Myers of the Las Vegas Raiders as they head to the Bayou to take on the New Orleans Saints? Look, it's Brock Bowers or it's Jacoby Myers in this Raiders passing attack. Make no mistake about it. Myers, he's currently averaging 9.6 targets per game and a target share of 23.8%, accounting for a team receiving market share of 28.8% since week number 12. And since week number 8, Myers has averaged 14.1 fantasy points per contest, and his 113 fantasy points, that has earned him wide receiver 23 status. That ranks him higher than the likes of Drake London, Mike Evans, and yes, Devonta Smith over that period. Now, before last week's 6.1 fantasy point performance, Myers, he had strung together 4 weeks of more than 10 fantasy points. So you know the consistency has been there for much of the season. This week, expect Myers to get back on track as he faces the Saints secondary that before their Monday night showdown against the Packers had allowed 471 receiving yards, 4 touchdowns to opposing wide receivers over the last 4 weeks. That works out to about 37.93 fantasy points per game, the 8th most. That makes sense if you consider what they've done on the season. The Saints have allowed the 7th most fantasy points to the wide receiver position, allowing 36.3 per game on the season. Now let's talk about those wide receivers that I'm sitting this week, and I'm going to start with one of my favorites, and that's Cooper Kupp of the Los Angeles Rams as they take on the Arizona Cardinals. Over the last 5 weeks, Cooper Kupp's fantasy production has been propped up by a couple touchdowns. And you know what? That's fine. Touchdowns matter. Tutties matters. We love tutties here on this show. But when we take a look at it, Cooper Kupp has just got 3 100-yard receiving games this season, and he hasn't produced a such performance since November 17th. Now, the likelihood of that happening again this week is not very high. Back on September 15th, Kupp and the Rams, they faced this Cardinals team, with Arizona limiting Kupp to just 4 catches for 37 yards. And over the last 4 weeks, Arizona has been the 6th stingiest unit versus opposing wide receivers there, allowing just 29.05 fantasy points per game. And over that 4-week window, they've allowed just 43 receptions and 548 receiving yards. Since week 12, Kupp has accounted for just 19% of the team's market receiving share, playing the role of Robin to Nakua's Batman. Now, Nakua, he has produced 48% of the receiving market share there for the Rams, second only to A.J. Brown, while leading the NFL in target share with 37.5%. This is good for the Rams, not so much for Kupp and his fantasy managers. Another wide receiver that I'm sitting this week, you probably should have been dropped off your roster a long time ago, and that is Amari Cooper as the Bills take on the New York Jets. Remember that meme where the guy's kind of poking and asking something to do anything at this point? That's how fantasy managers have to feel when it comes to Amari Cooper. His single greatest contribution to this Bills offense was a lateral pass back to Josh Allen. Since the bye week, Cooper, he has averaged 5.4 fantasy points per game, including a 15.5 fantasy point performance there in week number 15. He has accounted for just 21.7 fantasy points over those 4 games. Meanwhile, there are literally 5 different wide receivers right now that are averaging more than 21.7 fantasy points per game. That's crazy to me. That is crazy to even think about how much of a cliff that Amari Cooper has dropped off for fantasy managers. And it doesn't get any easier this week. Cooper and the Bills, they host that Jets team that has allowed the second fewest fantasy points per game, 28.92 on the season. Only the Denver Broncos have allowed fewer than the 10 receiving touchdowns that the Jets have surrendered this season to the wide receiver position. And finally, you have to sit Jerry Jeudy. Rip that Band-Aid off. It is what it is. If it was bad enough last week that the quarterback pecking order went from Dorian Thompson-Robinson to Bailey Zappi to Jameis Winston as the emergency quarterback. This is an emergency, Cleveland, and yet you've got your best quarterback as your third option. This week, Jeudy, he's primarily going to draw the coverage of Jalen Ramsey. Again, that is not a good thing. Mention DTR to just about anyone, and you go from the fantasy penthouse to the fantasy outhouse in about 3 seconds. We knew expectations were low, but really? Jerry Jeudy has been one of the top fantasy receivers since week number 8, completely immobilized by Thompson, Robinson, and Brown's management. We're talking about a receiver that had been averaging 21.1 fantasy points per game, with his lowest outing being 12.9 fantasy points between weeks 8 through 15 there, relegated to just 2 receptions on 3 targets for 20 yards. As long as Thompson Robinson is viewed as the best option by the Browns coaching staff, Jeudy is an untouchable fantasy asset, especially against the 4th stingiest defense this season against fantasy wide receivers. That being said, if you want to get in touch with those fantasy points, head over to RotoBaller.com today to get all the latest fantasy football news and analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll get me there 24/7, catering to all your fantasy football needs. See you then.